I stood frozen at the ballroom entrance, watching my future mother-in-law direct an army of florists like a general commanding troops. Alina Beckett, dressed in gold silk that screamed, "Look at me," gestured dramatically at crystal chandeliers while barking orders into her phone. "Higher, the arrangements need to be higher," she shouted. "This is my son's wedding and it will be perfect." My stomach twisted into knots. My wedding, my plans. Every single decision I'd made over 6 months, the intimate garden ceremony, the soft string quartet, the wildflower bouquets had vanished. In their place stood Alina's vision, a grand ballroom spectacle with ice sculptures, a 10-piece band, and enough roses to supply an entire flower shop. Guests who'd arrived early for the rehearsal gathered around her, nodding and smiling, thinking I was thrilled with all this luxury. But I wasn't thrilled. I was fighting back tears, my hands shaking as I clutched my phone. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. My own wedding had been stolen before it even began, transformed into Alina's personal showcase. She spotted me standing there and her face lit up with triumph. She walked over, heels clicking sharply against marble floors, and placed a cold hand on my shoulder. "You should be grateful, dear," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "I saved your wedding from being ordinary." My name is Alina Torres, and I'm 28 years old. 3 months ago, this was supposed to be the happiest time of my life. I just got engaged to Aaron Beckett, the man I loved more than anything. We'd spent our first date at a botanical garden, walking through paths lined with jasmine and honeysuckle. When he proposed, it was under an old oak tree at sunset, just the two of us. Simple, perfect, meaningful. That's what I wanted our wedding to be, a reflection of us, not a performance for others. I'm a graphic designer who works from a small home studio. I love quiet mornings with coffee, old bookstores, and handwritten letters. I'm not someone who needs the spotlight or craves attention. My dream wedding was 50 guests maximum, an outdoor ceremony where you could hear birds singing, and a reception where everyone actually talked to each other instead of posing for social media photos. But Alina had different ideas. From the moment Aaron told her we were engaged, she'd been planning, not helping planning. And every time I tried to speak up, she'd smile that tight smile and say, "Trust me, dear, I've done this before." She hadn't just rewritten my wedding. She'd erased me from it completely. And I'd smiled through every change, believing that keeping the peace was more important than speaking up. That was my first mistake. The warning signs started early, but I'd ignored them. 2 weeks after our engagement, Alina invited me to lunch at an expensive restaurant downtown. "We need to discuss the wedding," she'd said cheerfully over the phone. I'd arrived excited, bringing a notebook filled with ideas, pressed flower samples, photos of garden venues, a playlist for the ceremony. Alina had glanced at my notebook for exactly 3 seconds before pushing it aside. "Oh, honey, those are sweet starter thoughts," she'd said, patting my hand. "But let's talk about the real plans." She'd pulled out her own leather-bound planner filled with magazine clippings and vendor business cards. "I've already contacted the Plaza Hotel about their grand ballroom," she'd announced. "It's perfect for at least 200 guests." My heart had sunk. 200, Aaron and I were thinking 50, maybe 75 at most, something intimate. Alina had laughed, not a warm laugh, but the kind that makes you feel small. "Intimate weddings are lovely for certain types of people, but the Becketts have a reputation to maintain. Aaron's father was a respected attorney. We have colleagues, business associates, family friends who would be deeply offended if they weren't included." She'd already started the guest list, she'd explained, pulling out a spreadsheet. Her friends, her husband's former law partners, her book club, her tennis instructor. "My college roommates. We can probably squeeze in a few of your friends," she'd said dismissively. That lunch lasted 3 hours. By the end, I'd agreed to think about the ballroom. A month later, I walked into Bella's bridal boutique to pick up my wedding dress. I'd found it 6 weeks earlier, a simple, elegant lace gown with long sleeves and a flowing train. It was perfect, understated, romantic, me. But when the boutique owner, Mrs. Mrs. Phillips, brought out a garment bag, my heart stopped. "Here's your dress," she'd said brightly. "Your mother-in-law was so excited about the changes." I'd unzipped the bag with trembling hands. Inside wasn't my dress. It was a monstrosity, a ball gown covered in thousands of crystals and beads with a sweetheart neckline I'd specifically said I didn't want. The skirt was so heavy I could barely lift it. "What is this?" I'd whispered. Mrs. Phillips looked confused. "Your mother-in-law came in last week. She said you changed your mind, that you wanted something more formal. She paid the difference and everything." My vision had blurred with tears. I never changed my mind. This isn't my dress. The boutique owner's face had gone pale. Oh no, oh I'm so sorry. She seemed so certain and she had your appointment details. I'd called Alina immediately. She'd answered on the third ring, her voice bright and unbothered. Alina, did you see the new dress? Isn't it stunning? You changed my dress without asking me, I'd said, my voice shaking. Alina, that was my choice, mine. There was a pause, then that familiar condescending tone. Oh, sweetie, you'll thank me on the wedding day. The original looked too plain. This one photograph's better. That evening, I'd confronted her properly. Aaron and I had driven to his parents' house, and I'd walked in determined to stand my ground. Alina had been arranging flowers in her pristine kitchen, classical music playing softly in the background. We need to talk about the dress, I'd said firmly. Alina had barely looked up. There's nothing to discuss. The new dress is perfect. You'll see when you try it on properly. I don't want to try it on. I want my original dress back. She'd set down her pruning shears and turned to face me, her expression hardening. Alina, dear, I understand you're young and this is your first wedding, but I've been to dozens of society weddings. I know what works and what doesn't. Your dress would have looked homemade in those ballroom lights. It's my wedding. My voice had risen despite my efforts to stay calm. I should get to choose what I wear. Alina had sighed, the kind of sigh you give a difficult child. Of course it's your wedding. No one's saying otherwise. I'm simply trying to help you avoid embarrassment. The Beckett family has standards. I'd looked at Aaron, standing silently beside his mother. Say something, I'd pleaded. He'd shifted uncomfortably, rubbing the back of his neck. Mom's just trying to help, Alina. Maybe we could compromise. But there was no compromise in Alina's eyes, only her way. That night, lying in bed, I'd realized something terrifying. She didn't fear me because I'd never made her. I'd been so focused on being the perfect future daughter-in-law that I'd forgotten to be myself. The engagement party had been the breaking point I should have recognized earlier. Alina had insisted on hosting it at the country club where she was a member. Just a small gathering, she'd promised. 50 people, tops. The night of the party, over 100 guests had filled the elegant ballroom. I'd arrived in the simple blue dress I'd chosen, only to find Alina greeting guests in a gown that looked like something from a royal wedding. Halfway through the evening, she'd grabbed the microphone from the DJ. Everyone, if I could have your attention, the room had quieted. I want to thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate Aaron and Alina's engagement. She'd paused, smiling at the crowd. And I'm thrilled to share some details about the wedding I've been planning. Let's toast to my vision for this celebration. Her friends had raised their glasses enthusiastically. My mother, sitting at a corner table with my aunt and 2 cousins, had looked stunned. My best friend Taylor had leaned over and whispered, "Did she just say her vision?" I'd caught my reflection in one of the room's massive mirrors. Fake smiles stretched across my face, eyes shimmering with unshed tears. A woman playing a role in someone else's story. That was the moment something inside me shifted. That was the night I stopped trying to please Alina and started planning my escape. 2 weeks before the wedding, my mother had called me crying. Mom never cried. She was the strongest person I knew. A woman who'd raised 3 kids alone after my father died, who'd worked 2 jobs to send us to good schools, who never complained about anything. Hearing her voice break over the phone had shattered me. Alina, honey, I don't know how to tell you this, she'd said between sobs. I got the final seating chart today from Alina's wedding coordinator. My heart had started pounding. And I'm not on it. Your aunt and cousins aren't on it. They said there's no room for extended family, that we should understand the space limitations. I'd felt the blood drain from my face. My mother, who dreamed of this day since I was little, who'd saved money for years to help pay for the wedding, had been erased from the guest list. What about Uncle Marco and Aunt Sophia? I'd asked, though I already knew the answer. Not invited. Alina's assistant said the Beckett family side needed more room for business associates. I'd sat down on my apartment floor, phone pressed to my ear, tears streaming down my face. I'll fix it, Mom, I'd whispered. I promise I'll fix everything. But even as I'd said the words, I'd known the truth. This wasn't just about a seating chart or a dress or a venue. This was about being slowly erased from my own life story. That night, I'd made my decision. I was done being erased. The email had arrived by accident, but it had changed everything. I'd been copied on a message chain between Alina and the florist, probably a mistake when someone hit reply all instead of just replying to Alina. The subject line read, Final arrangements per client request. I'd opened it casually, expecting to see updates about the rose arrangements Alina had insisted on. Instead, I'd found something that made my hands shake. "Please note," Alina had written to every vendor, "the bride is too emotional and overwhelmed with wedding planning. From this point forward, handle all communications and decisions through me exclusively. Do not contact Alina Tours directly for any approvals or changes. I'm taking over full coordination to reduce her stress." Taking over. Not helping. Not supporting. Taking over. I'd scrolled through the rest of the chain. The photographer had been told not to send me preview poses for approval. The caterer had been instructed to ignore my dietary requests for vegetarian options because most guests prefer traditional choices. The DJ had been told to disregard my playlist entirely. Alina had literally banned vendors from contacting me about my own wedding. She'd wanted me erased from every decision, every choice, every moment. I'd sat in my home office, staring at that email for 20 minutes. My initial shock had slowly transformed into something else. Not rage, rage was hot and messy. This was cold clarity. Crystal clear understanding that if I didn't act now, I'd spend my entire marriage being pushed aside, overruled, diminished. I'd forwarded the email to myself at a private account Alina didn't know about. Then I'd started making plans. That evening, I'd tried one last time to get through to Aaron. We'd been at his apartment, supposedly planning our honeymoon, but I couldn't focus on anything except the email I'd discovered. "We need to talk about your mother," I'd said, setting down the travel brochures. Aaron had looked up from his laptop, already defensive. "What did she do now?" "She sent emails to all our vendors telling them not to contact me. She's banned me from making any decisions about our own wedding." I'd shown him the email chain on my phone. He'd read it, his expression flickering between guilt and frustration, then handed the phone back. "Look, I know Mom can be intense, but she means well. She just wants everything to be perfect." "Perfect for who?" My voice had cracked. "This isn't about perfection, Aaron. This is about control. She's taken over everything, the venue, the guest list, my dress, the menu. My own mother isn't even invited anymore." Aaron had sighed heavily, rubbing his temples, a gesture I'd seen him do countless times when his mother was mentioned. "Let her feel included, Alina. She's excited. After the wedding, things will calm down." "Will they?" I'd asked quietly. "Or will she plan our first anniversary party without asking, redecorate our house when we're not home, name our future children before we even conceive them?" He'd looked away, unable to answer. That's when I'd realized the devastating truth. Aaron loved me, but he loved his peace more. He'd spent his entire life avoiding confrontation with his mother, and he wasn't going to start now, not even for me. The invitations had been the final straw. They'd arrived at my apartment without warning, a heavy cream-colored envelope with gold embossing. I'd opened it, expecting to see the simple, elegant design Aaron and I had chosen together months ago. Instead, I'd found something that made my breath catch. Across the top, in elaborate script, it read, "Mrs. Alina Beckett requests the honor of your presence at the wedding of her son, Aaron Michael Beckett, to Alina Marie Tours." Below that, in smaller print, "A celebration hosted by the Beckett family." My name appeared once. Aaron's name appeared 3 times. Alina's name dominated the entire invitation. I'd sunk onto my couch, holding that invitation in shaking hands. This wasn't just control anymore. This was ownership. She'd claimed my wedding as her property, her event, her show. I'd called Aaron, but he hadn't answered. So I'd sat there alone, staring at that invitation, and something inside me had finally snapped. Not broken, transformed. My hands had stopped shaking. My mind had cleared, and for the first time in months, I'd smiled. A real smile, not the fake one I'd been wearing like a mask, because I'd made my decision. While everyone prepared for Alina's grand ballroom wedding, I was going to take back what was mine. And I was going to do it without a single argument, without a single confrontation, without giving her any warning at all. The next morning, I'd started making calls. First, I'd contacted Willow Creek Gardens, the venue Aaron and I had originally fallen in love with before Alina had upgraded us to the Plaza Hotel. "This is Alina Tours," I'd said to the events coordinator. "I know this is last minute, but is there any chance you have availability 2 weeks from Saturday?" There was a pause then. "Actually, yes. We had a cancellation yesterday. The bride called off her wedding." It had felt like fate. "I'll take it." Over the next 3 days, I'd worked in secret, rebuilding my wedding from scratch. I'd contacted a different florist, One Alina didn't know and ordered wildflower arrangements, exactly what I'd wanted from the beginning. I'd found a string quartet through a friend's recommendation. I'd hired a photographer who specialized in intimate outdoor ceremonies. Every vendor swore to secrecy. I'd used my personal email account, not the shared one that Alina had somehow gotten access to. I'd paid deposits from my own savings, money I'd been putting aside for years. Each phone call felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Each decision, made without Alina's approval, without anyone's permission except my own, felt like breathing again after being underwater. My mother had been my first call after booking the venue. "Mom, I need your help with something," I'd said, "and it has to stay completely secret." When I'd explained the plan, she'd been quiet for a long moment. Then she'd said, her voice fierce with pride, "Let's take back your wedding." The secret planning consumed me. I'd created a private group chat with my mother, my best friend Taylor, and my cousin Nina, the only people I trusted completely. Every morning at 6, before Aaron woke up, I'd coordinate details. Taylor had handled invitations. She designed simple, beautiful cards and personally delivered them to the 50 guests I actually wanted there. My real family, my true friends, people who loved me for me, not for the Beckett name. Each invitation had included a note. "Please keep this confidential. Details to follow." My mother had arranged transportation. She'd rented a small shuttle bus to bring guests from the hotel to the garden, timed perfectly so everyone would leave before Alina realized something was wrong. Nina had worked with the new caterer, planning a menu of the foods I actually loved, my grandmother's recipes, dishes from my childhood, real food instead of Alina's pretentious 5-course meal. We'd worked like spies, coordinating through encrypted apps, meeting in coffee shops across town, never discussing anything where Aaron or his family might overhear. It had been exhausting and exhilarating at the same time. But the hardest part had been pretending. Every time Alina had called to discuss her wedding, I'd nodded and smiled. Every time she'd made another change, swapping out the cake flavor, adding more of her friends to the guest list, choosing bridesmaid dresses my friends couldn't afford, I'd bitten my tongue and said, "That sounds lovely." Aaron had noticed I seemed calmer, less stressed. "See," he'd said one night, "Mom was right. Once you let go of trying to control everything, it's easier." I'd smiled and nodded, not trusting myself to speak, if he only knew. Playing along had become a performance art. At the final dress fitting, the one for Alina's hideous crystal-covered gown, I'd stood on the platform and let the seamstress pin the hem while Alina had circled me like a shark. "You look like royalty," Alina had declared, snapping photos with her phone. "This is exactly the image the Beckett family needs." I'd smiled at my reflection, thinking about my real dress hanging in Taylor's closet, the original lace gown I'd secretly bought back from the boutique using my own money. "You were right, Alina," I'd lied smoothly. "This dress is perfect for the Plaza Ballroom." Her face had lit up with triumph. She'd wanted my submission, my gratitude, my acknowledgement that she knew best. So I'd given her exactly that, a performance so convincing she'd never suspect what was coming. At the rehearsal dinner, held at the country club, naturally, I'd sat quietly while Alina had directed traffic. She'd changed the seating chart 3 times, moving my family to increasingly distant tables. She'd given a speech about welcoming Alina into the Beckett legacy that had made me sound like an acquisition rather than a person. Aaron's father had toasted to Alina's vision coming to life. No one had toasted to us, to our love, to the actual marriage we were supposed to be celebrating. I'd caught my mother's eye across the room. She'd given me a subtle nod. Everything was in place. Tomorrow, Alina would learn that control was an illusion. The night before the wedding, Alina had thrown a pre-wedding dinner for her special guests, the society friends she'd insisted on inviting, people I'd never met who'd never bothered to learn my name. I'd shown up deliberately late, wearing jeans and a casual top instead of the cocktail dress she'd laid out for me at her house. "Alina," Alina had called out when I'd arrived. "We were just discussing tomorrow's schedule. The wedding party needs to arrive at the plaza by 9 for photos. The ceremony begins at 3 sharp." I'd walked through the room slowly, accepting awkward hugs from strangers who called me the bride, but couldn't remember I was a graphic designer or that I loved old bookstores or that my favorite color was sage green. They only knew I was marrying Aaron Beckett, Alina's son. The prize. When dinner was served, Alina had stood again, glass raised high. "Tomorrow will be unforgettable," she'd announced, her voice ringing with confidence. The wedding I've planned will be the event of the season. Everyone will remember this day. I'd met her eyes across the table and smiled. A real smile this time, not the fake one I'd been wearing for months. "You're absolutely right, Alina," I'd said softly. "Tomorrow will be unforgettable. You have no idea." She'd looked momentarily puzzled by something in my tone, but then someone had clinked their glass for a toast and the moment had passed. That night I'd barely slept, not from anxiety, from anticipation. Tomorrow, I would walk down the aisle I'd chosen, wearing the dress I'd selected, surrounded by people who truly loved me. At midnight, while Alina slept peacefully believing everything was going according to her plan, my team moved into action. Taylor and her husband had rented a truck. My cousin Nina had recruited 3 of her brothers. Together, they'd transported everything to Willow Creek Gardens: chairs, tables, sound equipment, lighting. The garden's own event staff had met them there, working through the night to transform the space into my dream wedding venue. My mother had stayed up coordinating, making sure every detail matched what I'd planned. She'd arranged string lights in the oak trees, the same trees where Aaron had proposed. She'd set up a simple wooden arch wrapped in jasmine and honeysuckle. She'd placed wildflowers in mason jars on every table. By 4 a.m, Taylor had texted me a photo. Even through my phone's screen, it had taken my breath away. It was perfect. Simple, intimate, beautiful. Everything Alina's ballroom spectacle wasn't. I'd gotten 3 hours of sleep before my alarm went off. My stomach had been in knots, not from fear, but from the strange electricity of knowing I was about to do something irreversible. There would be no going back after today. No more pretending, no more keeping the peace, no more being erased. Today, Alina would learn that some people refuse to disappear. Today, I would show Aaron what he should have been protecting all along. Today, I would marry the man I loved, but I would do it on my own terms. Morning arrived like a storm about to break. At the Plaza Hotel, Alina's carefully planned wedding began falling apart before anyone understood why. Guests started arriving at 2:30 for the 3 o'clock ceremony. They walked into the grand ballroom expecting flowers and music and a bride getting ready in the suite upstairs. Instead, they found confusion. The hotel staff looked puzzled when guests asked for directions to the wedding. "I'm sorry," the concierge kept saying. "We don't have a wedding scheduled today." Alina's friends called her cell phone frantically. "Alina, where's the ceremony? There's no one here. Did something happen?" Alina had been at home getting ready, planning her grand entrance. When the calls started flooding in, she'd grabbed her purse and driven to the plaza in record time, heels clicking urgently as she'd rushed through the lobby. The ballroom had been empty. No flowers, no chairs, no band, just bare walls and confused hotel staff. "There's been a terrible mistake," Alina had shouted at the manager. "I booked this room months ago. This is my son's wedding." The manager had pulled up his computer system. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your reservation was canceled 2 weeks ago, by you according to our records." Alina's face had gone white, then red. "I never canceled anything." But I had, using her email account that she'd carelessly left logged in on my laptop. The cancellation had been buried in a long thread of messages she'd never bothered to read carefully. Meanwhile, 8 miles away, I was getting ready in a small cottage at Willow Creek Gardens. My mother helped me into my real wedding dress, the simple lace gown with long sleeves and a flowing train. It fit perfectly, like it had been made for this moment. Taylor pinned wildflowers in my hair while Nina made sure every detail was perfect. Through the cottage window, I could see guests arriving. My aunts and uncles, my childhood friends, Aaron's cousin who'd been quietly supportive when his mother wasn't watching. 50 people who loved me for me. The string quartet started playing softly in the background. Aaron had arrived early, still confused about the change of plans but trusting me. I told him at breakfast, "Trust me today, please just trust me." He'd looked uncertain but had nodded. Now he stood under the oak tree where he'd proposed, wearing the simple gray suit we'd chosen together, not the formal tuxedo Alina had ordered. When I walked through the garden archway, his face had transformed. His eyes had filled with tears. "Alina," he'd breathed. "You did this?" I'd nodded, my own eyes wet with emotion. "This is us," I'd whispered. "No performance, no show, just us." The ceremony had been everything I dreamed of. Birds singing, sunlight filtering through oak leaves, my mother crying happy tears in the front row, my best friend holding my bouquet of wildflowers, the officiant speaking about love that honors and respects, that lifts up rather than controls. We were halfway through our vows when I heard it. Car doors slamming, heels clicking urgently on the garden path, Aliner's voice cutting through the peaceful ceremony like a knife. "Stop this immediately." Aliner had stormed into the garden, her gold dress catching sunlight like a warning signal. Guests had turned in their seats, mouths open in shock. Aaron had frozen beside me, his eyes going wide. "How dare you?" Aliner had marched down the aisle, her face twisted with fury and humiliation. "You embarrassed me. You ruined everything. Do you have any idea what you've done?" The garden had gone completely silent. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. I'd felt every eye on me, waiting to see if I would crumble, apologize, run away. Instead, I'd straightened my shoulders and held my ground. My mother had stood up slowly from her seat in the front row. She'd faced Aliner directly, this woman who'd tried to erase her from her own daughter's wedding, and spoken in a voice I'd never heard before. Calm, strong, unshakable. "This isn't your day, Aliner," my mother had said. "This is Alina's wedding. You can either sit down and be respectful, or you can leave. Those are your only choices." Aliner's mouth had opened and closed like a fish out of water. She looked to Aaron, expecting him to defend her, to take her side like he always had. But something had changed. Aaron had been standing there, seeing everything clearly for the first time. The garden I'd chosen, the guests I'd invited, the mother-in-law who just crashed our ceremony demanding control. He'd taken my hand, squeezing it tightly. Then he'd turned to his mother. "Mom," Aaron had said, his voice shaking but firm, "please sit down." Aliner had stared at him like he'd slapped her. "What did you say?" "I said sit down. This is Alina's wedding. Our wedding, not yours." The words had hung in the air between them, years of unspoken tension finally breaking through. Aliner's face had cycled through shock, hurt, and rage. "After everything I've done," she'd hissed. "I planned this entire wedding. I spent months." "You took over," Aaron had interrupted quietly. "You didn't plan with us, you planned instead of us, and I should have stopped you weeks ago. I'm sorry I didn't." He'd looked at me then, really looked at me, and I'd seen understanding in his eyes. Understanding of how small he'd let me become, how much he'd asked me to sacrifice for his mother's comfort. "I'm sorry," he'd whispered to me. "You shouldn't have had to do this alone." Aliner had stood there, trembling with fury and humiliation, while 50 guests watched in complete silence. Finally, Aaron's father had appeared behind her, having just arrived from the empty hotel. "Aliner," he'd said gently, taking her arm. "Come sit down. Let them finish." She jerked away from him, but she'd had no choice. Every eye in the garden was watching, waiting. If she made another scene, if she dragged this out further, she wouldn't just lose control of the wedding. She'd lose her dignity completely. She'd walked stiffly to an empty chair at the back and sat down, her face frozen in barely contained rage. The officiant had cleared her throat nervously. "Shall we continue?" I'd nodded, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. Aaron had squeezed my hand again, and we turned back to face each other. When it came time for my vows, I'd spoken clearly, my voice carrying across the garden. I'd thanked everyone who'd supported me, everyone who'd shown up with love instead of control. "I'm grateful," I'd said, looking at my mother, at Taylor, at the family and friends who'd kept my secret. "To everyone who helped me remember that my voice matters, that I matter, even when someone tried very hard to make me forget." I hadn't looked at Aliner when I'd said it. I hadn't needed to. Everyone understood exactly who I meant. Aaron's vows had been different than what we'd practiced. He'd gone off script, speaking from the heart in a way I'd never heard before. "Alina, I promise to protect you," he'd said, his voice cracking. "Not just from the world, but from anyone who tries to diminish you, even if that person is someone I love. Especially then. You shouldn't have had to fight this battle alone, and I'm sorry you did. From today forward, we fight together." The guests had erupted in applause. Even through my tears, I'd seen Aliner sitting rigid in her chair, her face unreadable. When the officiant had pronounced us married, when Aaron had kissed me under that oak tree while wildflowers swayed in the breeze, I'd felt something I hadn't felt in months. Free. The reception had been exactly what I'd dreamed of. Simple, joyful, real. We'd eaten my grandmother's recipes instead of pretentious French cuisine. We danced to the playlist Aaron and I had created together instead of Aliner's formal band. We'd laughed with people who knew us, who loved us, who weren't there for show. But the real chaos had started online. Taylor's sister, who'd been a guest, had posted a short video clip to social media without realizing it would explode. The video showed Aliner storming into the garden, my mother standing up to her, and Aaron finally choosing me over his mother's demands. The caption read, "Bride outsmarts controlling mill by secretly moving entire wedding. This is how you take your power back." Within hours, it had thousands of views. By the next morning, it had gone viral, hundreds of thousands of people watching, commenting, sharing their own stories of boundary setting and family drama. News outlets had started picking it up. Blogs had written articles analyzing what they called the wedding rebellion. My phone had been flooded with notifications, messages from strangers saying, "You're my hero, and I wish I'd had your courage, and thank you for showing me it's okay to stand up for myself." Aliner's friends had seen the video. Erin's extended family had seen it. Everyone in her social circle had seen it. The carefully crafted image she'd spent decades building, the perfect hostess, the devoted mother, the woman who orchestrated flawless events, had shattered in a 3-minute clip. For 3 weeks after the wedding, Aliner hadn't spoken to us. Not a call, not a text, not a word. Erin had tried reaching out several times, but she'd ignored him. His father had apologized privately, admitting he'd known Aliner had gone too far but hadn't known how to stop her. "She's humiliated," he'd explained. "The video is everywhere. Her friends keep asking questions." I'd almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then I'd remembered my mother crying because she'd been removed from the guest list. I'd remembered vendors being told not to contact me. I'd remembered that invitation with Aliner's name dominating mine. Erin and I had settled into our marriage with a new understanding. He'd started going to therapy to work through his lifelong pattern of avoiding conflict with his mother. He'd set boundaries, real ones, about when she could visit, what decisions were ours alone, how our future would be built. "I spent my whole life trying to keep her happy," he'd admitted one night. "I didn't realize I was sacrificing everyone else's happiness to do it, especially yours." Slowly, Aliner's friends had started reaching out to me, not to take sides, but to apologize. Several had quietly admitted they'd seen Aliner's controlling behavior at other events and had said nothing. "We thought it was none of our business," one woman had confessed over coffee. But watching that video made me realize silence is complicity. The narrative had shifted. I was no longer the ungrateful bride Aliner had tried to paint me as. I was the woman who'd stood her ground. 2 months after the wedding, on a cold November afternoon, Aliner had appeared at our apartment door. I'd been working in my home studio when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I'd seen her standing there, dressed simply for once. No designer clothes, no dramatic jewelry, just a woman who looked tired and older than I'd remembered. Erin had been at work. It was just Aliner and me. I'd opened the door slowly. "Can I come in?" she'd asked. Her voice had been different, quieter, less certain. I'd stepped aside and she'd walked into our small living room, looking around at the photos on our walls, pictures from our real wedding, the one she'd tried to stop. She'd sat on the edge of the couch, holding her purse in her lap like a shield. For a long moment, neither of us had spoken. Finally, Aliner had looked up at me. "You humiliated me," she'd said, not angry this time, just stating a fact. I'd sat across from her, choosing my words carefully. "You did that yourself, Aliner." "I just stopped helping you do it to me." She'd flinched, but she hadn't argued. "Everyone's seen that video, my friends, my colleagues, people from the club, they all know what happened." "Yes," I'd said simply, "they do. You could have come to me privately," she'd continued. "We could have talked about the wedding plans, compromised." I'd looked at her directly. "I tried that for months. Every time I spoke up, you dismissed me. Every boundary I set, you crossed. You didn't want compromise, Aliner. You wanted control, and when I finally took back what was mine, you call it humiliation." She'd been quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. "I thought I was helping," she'd said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted Erin's wedding to be perfect. I wanted people to see that the Becketts know how to celebrate important moments. But it wasn't Erin's wedding," I'd replied gently. "It was ours, mine and Erin's, and perfect doesn't mean expensive or impressive. Perfect means real. It means honest. It means two people starting their life together surrounded by love, not performance." Aliner had looked up then, and I'd seen something in her eyes I'd never seen before, uncertainty, maybe even regret. "I don't know how to fix this," she'd admitted. "I don't know if you can," I'd said honestly. "But you could start by understanding that I'm not your project to manage. I'm your son's wife, his partner, his equal, and if you want to be part of our lives going forward, you need to respect that." She'd nodded slowly, tears gathering in her eyes. "I'm not good at letting go." "I know," I'd said, "but you're going to have to learn." Months passed. Alina and I didn't become close. Maybe we never would, but we found a way to coexist. She started respecting boundaries, asking instead of demanding, accepting when Aaron and I said no to her suggestions. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes she'd slip back into old patterns, trying to plan our anniversary dinner without asking or showing up at our apartment unannounced. But Aaron had changed. He'd learned to speak up, to protect our space, to choose us over his mother's comfort. One evening in spring, 6 months after the wedding, I'd hosted a dinner party at our apartment. Just intimate friends and close family. My mother, Taylor, and her husband, my cousin Nina, a few colleagues from my design work. We'd gathered around our small dining table, talking and laughing, sharing stories about work and life and the ordinary beautiful moments that make up real relationships. I'd looked around that table and realized something profound. This was the family I'd built. Not through grand gestures or expensive events or carefully curated images, but through honesty, through standing up for what mattered, through refusing to be erased. Aaron had caught my eye across the table and smiled, the real smile I'd fallen in love with, not the tense one he'd worn when trying to navigate between his mother and me. My mother had squeezed my hand, pride shining in her eyes. Taylor had raised her glass in a quiet toast. This wasn't the wedding day Alina had planned. But it was the life I'd chosen, and that made all the difference. On our first anniversary, a cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail. I'd recognized Alina's handwriting immediately. My heart had raced as I'd opened it, half expecting another attempt at control, another boundary crossed. Instead, I'd found a simple card. No lengthy explanation, no excuses, no dramatic apology. Just 5 words written in Alina's careful script. "Your wedding was beautiful, Alina." I'd stood in our kitchen holding that card, reading those 5 words over and over. It wasn't everything I might have wanted. There was no acknowledgement of the pain she'd caused, no real apology for trying to erase me from my own celebration. But it was something. It was recognition. It was, in its own small way, respect. Aaron had read the card over my shoulder. "That's progress," he'd said quietly. "For her, that's huge." I'd nodded, carefully placing the card on our refrigerator next to photos from our real wedding, the garden ceremony, the wildflowers, the moment my mother had stood up to Alina with grace and strength. The video that had gone viral had long since faded from social media. People had moved on to new stories, new dramas, new moments of inspiration. But the lesson remained. I'd learned that standing up for yourself isn't cruel, it's necessary. That keeping the peace at the cost of your own voice isn't peace at all, it's surrender. That sometimes the people who love you need to see you stand firm before they understand how to love you properly. Alina would never admit she'd been wrong. She'd never apologize in the way I deserved. But she'd acknowledged, in her own way, that I'd been right to take back my wedding. And more importantly, I didn't need her approval anymore. I'd reclaimed something far more valuable than a perfect wedding day. I'd reclaimed myself. That evening, Aaron and I had driven to Willow Creek Gardens. The place was closed, but we'd walked the grounds anyway, finding the oak tree where we'd said our vows, where my mother had stood up for me, where Aaron had finally chosen us over his mother's demands. "Do you regret any of it?" Aaron had asked, holding my hand as we stood under the tree's branches. "The secrecy, the planning, the way everything happened." I'd thought about it carefully. About the months of pretending, the exhaustion of living a double life, the moment Alina had stormed into our ceremony with fury in her eyes, about all the fear and stress and uncertainty. Then I'd thought about saying my vows surrounded by people who truly loved me, about my mother's tears of joy, about the wildflowers in my hair, about finally being seen. "No," I'd said, "I don't regret any of it." Because some battles aren't about winning or losing, they're about refusing to disappear. They're about standing in your truth even when everyone around you insists you should be smaller, quieter, more accommodating. They're about building a life that honors who you really are, not who someone else thinks you should be. Alina had tried to take over my wedding plans, but in the end, she'd given me something unexpected, the clarity to know my own worth, the courage to fight for it, and the strength to build a life where I would never be erased again. The sunset filtered through the oak leaves, painting everything gold. Aaron pulled me close, and I rested my head against his shoulder. This moment, quiet, simple hours, was worth every difficult choice I'd made. "Happy anniversary," he whispered. I smiled, feeling the weight of the past year lift away. "Happy anniversary." And as we walked back through the garden where I'd reclaimed my story, I knew with absolute certainty I would never let anyone write my life for me again.